Hello, I'm Jillian. In my previous video called 9 Steps for Creating a Literature Review Paper, I shared the process I use with upper-level high school students and higher education students. This video on introductions and conclusions fits with step 8 of that video, write and edit your paper. In high school, you were likely taught to organize your paper so that in the introduction, you say what you're going to say, in the body of the paper, you say it, and in the conclusion, you say what you said. There's some insight to this, but the format is quite unsophisticated and uninspiring. Instead, think of taking your readers on a bit of a journey so that the introduction transports them into the specific world of your paper and establishes expectations, and the conclusion transports them back out of your paper into the larger world from which they came and offers a souvenir, something they might continue to think about. I envision this as two cones in mirror image. In the introduction, the context is narrowed as the author focuses the reader on the topic, and in the conclusion, it's expanded as the author relates back to the larger subject area. Despite the similarities in structure and overall objective, the introduction and conclusion vary in their content to serve more specific and distinct objectives. The introduction is guided by the question, "What is this paper about?" And the conclusion is guided by the question, "Why should anyone care?" Before we delve into what that entails, here are 3 basic tips. With most journeys, you know the destination before you plan the transportation. So I advise establishing the body of the paper in a good draft before writing the introduction and conclusion. That way, you know what you're introducing and concluding. Second, while you are researching and drafting the body, be on the lookout for content that would be suitable for the introduction and conclusion, and just jot down some notes so that you don't forget. And third, write the introduction and the conclusion together. This will help you create balance between the content and the structure and smooth transitioning between the more specific context and the broader context. So with the introduction, you're transporting readers into the world of your paper and establishing expectations. And just as I mentioned, this process is guided by the question, "What is this paper about?" To address this question and set up the reader, you should include the topic, some context, definitions, and a roadmap. State your topic in a way that piques the reader's interest. 2 tips for this. You can use a key statistic, question, anecdote, scenario, narrative, example, analogy, or news item. If you do, you might consider referring back to this in the conclusion to create some symmetry. Secondly, I tend not to use direct quotes here unless the person I'm quoting is iconic in this area. The reason is that I want to establish my own voice as the author of this paper, so I don't want to introduce another voice off the top. You want to let readers know how you're situating or positioning your topic. This is really about establishing boundaries regarding what you're including and what you're excluding and why and how you made these decisions. Here are some ways you can do that. You can identify types of resources that you're drawing on, whose work you're drawing on, disciplines, fields of study, theories, and frameworks that are relevant, temporal and/or geographical contexts, so time and place, more specific settings, and your own personal interest in this topic. Not all of these will be applicable to every paper, so use your judgment. Pause for a moment and read through the examples. Another tip. If your introduction is too long, let's say more than 15% of the total word count, and I'll say more on word count at the end, think about narrowing the context. Are you starting too broadly? Are giving too much context? What do readers really need to know to engage with your paper? This does not mean that you use a dictionary and give dictionary definitions. Rather, you are explaining how scholars understand and apply the terms relevant to your topic. You want to include variations and contradictions in how the terms are understood, and then how you have chosen to interpret and apply the terms to your paper. Tips. Stay within the body of literature for your topic, so your definitions are consistent with the scholarly conversation you're reporting on. Some terms take on different meanings in different topic areas, and you don't want to confuse this. Second, use citations to let the reader know where the definitions have come from. And third, in the introduction to your whole paper, which is what we're talking about here, define the terms that are relevant to your whole paper. If there are terms that are relevant only to sections of your paper, define those when you get to that section. This prevents overwhelming the reader right off the top. Pause again for a moment and read the example. Let your readers know what they can expect from your paper. You want to both orient and intrigue them. And you could do this by briefly outlining your conceptual framework. This is the key ideas or themes around which you have organized the body of your paper. Now, for more on conceptual frameworks, see step 5 of my video called 9 Steps for Creating a Literature Review Paper. Another tip. For shorter papers, maybe around 1,000 words, one sentence is likely enough. But for longer papers, maybe around 6,000 words, a couple of sentences might be required. Pause again and read the example. With the conclusion, you're transporting your readers back out of your paper and leaving them with something to continue thinking about. This process is guided by the question, why should anyone care? To address this question, you want to comment on the significance, present some analysis, and make recommendations. This is the most difficult part of any paper for me to write. I want to leave the readers feeling satisfied with what they just read, but also stimulated and inspired by it. But after writing the whole paper, it's so hard to think of what else to say. So that's why jotting down ideas while I'm researching and drafting the body is so helpful. Remind readers of the main themes you just discussed and state their implication to the larger subject area. This could be, for example, a contribution to one side of a debate among scholars, an impact on how scholars understand one aspect of the topic, or a new way of researching. 2 tips. If you identified in the introduction a statistic, question, anecdote, scenario, narrative, example, analogy, or news item, this is where you might want to refer to it again. 2, don't make claims or inferences that you didn't support in your paper. So for example, don't say this will impact world peace unless you really substantiated that in the discussion. Keep it reasonable. Pause again to read this example. Now that you've become a bit of an expert on your topic, you're in a position to make observations, voice an opinion, or take a stand. This might include, for example, noting questionable or unsubstantiated claims that others are making, identifying conflicting or controversial viewpoints, or exposing gaps, oversights, or omissions. If this is a literature review to set up a research study, you will articulate this as a research problem. Pause to read the example. Leave the reader with some suggestions for future directions or next steps regarding your topic. So for example, how you think the scholarship might progress with respect to research, professional practice, policy, or continuing education. You can also add how you and others might continue to engage with your topic. If this is a literature review to set up a study, you would include a research question that coincides with the problem you identified in your analysis. So if you identified the problem that there are few studies on how moral education is approached by teachers in China, then your question might be, what strategies do school teachers in China use to teach morality to their students? A final tip on length. You don't want the introduction or conclusion to overwhelm your paper. I've seen papers where the introduction is so long it seems to go on forever and ever. My rule of thumb is to keep them both between 5 and 10% of the total word count of your paper, not including the bibliography and reference lists that would come at the end. So if the paper is short, 1,000 words or so, the introduction and conclusion are closer to the 10% mark or 100 words each. If the paper is longer, maybe 6,000 words, they might be closer to 5 or 7%, about 300 to 420 words each. But they don't have to be the same length, just close enough so that the paper seems balanced. My introductions tend to be a bit longer than my conclusions. Here's a summary for easy reference. This is a general plan though. Papers differ, so always remember to check your assignment for specific criteria. I hope this has been helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and please add any additional tips that you would like to share with everyone. And watch the video on 9 steps for creating a literature review paper for guidelines on how to conceptualize the body of the paper.